from the start. Okay, great. So yeah, so thank you so much everybody for attending this virtual room. So the starting point for me then in thinking about loss and how to make its impacts and outcomes taken seriously is witnessing examples of loss in Manchester over a 15-year period and noting various resident-led campaigns across the built and natural environment in Manchester, and more recently doing a deeper dive into that loss or threat of loss from a research perspective. And secondly, loss becomes even more significant given the ongoing call and discourse at the moment around the need for community resilience and adaptation. And this terminology is used partly euphemistically, really, to ask people to cope with change. And that change might be the result of economic policies, growth and regeneration plans, and now, of course, in response to the ever-evolving climate emergency. So my presentation will be structured in three parts. So part one, I want to offer some reflection on the scholarship that's out there around loss, what's useful for us, what's not so useful for us in this forum around ageing. And hopefully that might be quite useful just to kind of situate this work where this work is in kind of conversation with other areas outside of ageing and health. And part two will offer my first case study based in Gorton, coming out of a particular research project. And then that will lead me into some early observations around the ward of Miles Platting and Newton Heath, where my current research is situated. And then part three will offer some recommendations and pose some questions back to you as the audience, which hopefully then you'll discuss in your breakout rooms. So part one then. So as I said, I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the literature that's out there around loss, and I hope you'll find this helpful for your own work and practice and organisations. So for me, it seems to fall into three categories or areas of disciplinary interest. So the first is heritage studies, which I call my own sort of discipline or home, if you like, for my own work, environmental humanities, and sociology and psychology. So the first then is heritage studies, which is a sort of love child between archaeology, sociology and the arts. And now arguably heritage as a sector and as a field of work relies on, to a large extent, on notions of endangerment or attempts to arrest or reverse processes of loss and change to culture and materiality. So, and that's where you get preservation policies come into play, and also other forms of documentation such as archives and databases and inventories, etc. And of course, conservation practices around artifacts and spaces and biodiversity. So there are two concepts which kind of emerge within heritage studies, and I've just put these two papers up here because I think they kind of capture some of this literature that's out there. So there's this first concept around inevitability, so this idea that loss is inevitable, and also that society, within society at the moment, there is a kind of loss aversion, so people being afraid to lose things. But what strikes me about these two concepts is how wholly inappropriate they are for working class and ex-industrial communities. So first, I think we need to question this notion of inevitability, because this negates power structures, it ignores decision-making processes. Inevitability of loss is not a neutral position, but the result of very specific actions and choices that are made within our systems. And also secondly, what I feel anyway is missing from a lot of this literature around loss aversion and inevitability is an acknowledgement of international neoliberal policies and development agendas, which places sort of economic competition at the centre. So these things are kind of not really addressed within this body of literature. So the second area then is environmental humanities. So environmental humanities is again an interdisciplinary area across ecological sciences and the broader humanities. And this literature is concerned with species and landscape loss and the accompanying risk to cultural skills and knowledge. And I find these are two wonderful publications if you're looking for kind of starting reading that really kind of go into this area in a kind of wonderful way. So this is just kind of my recommendations for you know, if you want to kind of pick up some of that reading. And so then the third area, as I mentioned, sits within sociology and psychology quite broadly, which focuses primarily on human loss, resulting in bereavement, grief, and trauma. And some of the more insightful scholarship shows that while loss is a universal experience, people facing severe disadvantage experience loss at a disproportionately higher rate than the general population. And these kinds of works here acknowledge that loss does not occur in isolation. So there are a number of factors which can act as protective or exacerbating factors. So socioeconomic status, the provision or lack of support, the shame that's associated with certain deaths or guilt experienced by bereavement, losses that are less understood or less validated by society can also provoke wider feelings of disenfranchisement. So what I'm proposing here then, really, as a topic for concern across practice and policy, connects across all three of these bodies of scholarship. So I'm kind of drawing on a concoction of concepts and ideas that are significant for issues of ageing and health. And there might be other scholarship that you can think of within your own areas of practice or policy, or within your own learning. So that's a very quick run through for some of the scholarship that's out there that's kind of interesting. So it sits across green spaces, green infrastructure, but also loss in terms of personal human loss and bereavement. So diving into part two then, so with all that kind of in mind, I wanted to introduce you to a particular case study that comes out of a project that I was involved in between 2016 and 2019. It's got quite a long title called Green Infrastructure and the Health and Wellbeing Influences on an Ageing Population, or GAIA for short. And I worked on a particular work package with Professor Chris Phillipson, who's actually a specialist in gerontology and ageing, and he works with MICRA, and some of you might know MICRA, the Centre for Research on Ageing. And our work package was really thinking about the barriers and motivation to participation within green spaces within the city and its associated values that people hold for these spaces. And I think something that's really important to kind of start with in thinking about the impact of green infrastructure loss on ageing communities is that research shows that 80% of time of those 75 and over is spent at home or in their immediate environment. So that's a huge amount of time spent at home. And then our GAIA research led to us understanding that on average, most people venture to local GI spaces that are under 1 kilometre from their front door. So this is really important things to kind of add together. So first of all, the fact that people are staying kind of quite isolated at home for 80% of their time as they get older, but also they are only venturing to those green spaces that are really close by. So you then kind of throw in loss of these spaces into the mix, and you can start to see where the problems begin to arise, or the challenges of that loss begin to arise. So I want to just continue with a few slides in relation to this project for a moment, which is just sharing with you motivations of older people engaging with green spaces and green infrastructure. Because if we understand the motivations as to why people want to engage with green spaces, then we can start to identify the potential impact of loss when people don't have access to these spaces. So I'll just whiz through this. These are just many of the groups that are involved in this particular research. And again, yeah, Luciana mentioned the various kind of creative methods. This is a qualitative approach to the research, but I won't talk about that. Let's whiz through this. Okay, so I'll land here first. So this is about individual factors motivating engagement with urban green and blue spaces. So we found emotional and personal connections to particular places were very important for people. The opportunity for personal achievement, opportunities for a variety of change, including as a result of life transitions, and having time for participation. So those are very personal, individual motivations for people engaging in green and blue spaces. Then there was this second element around social factors. So this is an opportunity to meet new people, an opportunity to share knowledge and skills, and the availability of older placemakers and organisations to relate with each other and to engage with each other. So those are kind of more social factors, which I suppose might be very expected. Actually, these are the kinds of things that come out when we look at research around green and blue spaces. And then there are, of course, the environmental factors that are motivating engagement. So the environmental quality and character of particular places. So ensuring that, you know, spaces have interesting plants or wildlife, particular colours, shapes and scent and movement. Signs of care and caring through environmentally sensitive maintenance and links to people and organisations with dedicated maintenance roles, and the accessibility and facilities that help to support engagement. So basic things like, you know, benches and toilets that kind of seem obvious, but you know, they are also part of those wider sort of environmental factors. But this aspect of environmental quality and the character of particular places becomes important for this particular case study that I'm just going to share with you now. So, and there might be people on the call here, I don't know, who might recognise part of this space. So this is an angle, just a very small angle in the autumn actually, from Knutsford Vale in Gorton. So Knutsford Vale was an old Jackson brickwork site, and then it was a waste dump, and then it was reclaimed and rewilded land owned by the council, but cared for by a group of excellent local residents, the Friends of Knutsford Vale. And they had won fundraising for their, you know, fundraising bids for their work, and also acknowledgement for their volunteering. And then came the blow that the land was to be sold for redevelopment. So what I'm going to go through now were the identified risks associated with the loss of this space that came out of co-research with the residents. So we wrote all of this up as a report, and that report was submitted as part of a case against development of this particular space. So what I'm going to read to you now are some of the extracts from that report. And many of the residents, I would say, you know, really expressed concern and dismay at the thought of losing the Vale or of the space being altered significantly. And alongside the loss of the benefits that we detailed in the report, we also managed to identify a number of significant risks posed by the proposed planning application being approved. So I'm going to just talk those through with you now. So what I've done is I've highlighted them here, and I've added some of the quotes from the residents themselves. So the first issue then is mental health issues. So this was the first risk that we identified. So many of the residents described the positive influence of the Vale on their mental and physical well-being, and for a few, walking or otherwise being in the Vale was an important part of caring for their mental health and preventing relapses and reliance on health services. Social isolation. Our respondents reveal that the Vale provided themselves and others with a space in which social interaction was normalised and facilitated. Accessing the Vale offered a space for older residents to speak to others, to feel part of a community, to connect with people from other generations and to transmit knowledge. These were significant factors in helping to prevent social isolation in older people in the area. Decreased physical activity. In its current layout, the Vale offers the opportunity to undertake a number of gentle and therapeutic forms of exercise, and furthermore, the ability to access nature and wildlife, to take part in wildlife volunteering, and to walk dogs in the space was revealed to be important for encouraging residents to exercise. And in terms of this decreased physical activity and in relation to the mental health issues, it's also worth actually just mentioning to you now that I think we recognise as the researchers the mental and physical toll that the stress of the campaign actually caused on residents as well. And all the residents involved did have some kind of sort of health condition of some kind. And so thinking back to that other literature around in areas of health deprivation, loss can have a greater impact. So anyway, so that's just something to kind of bear in mind, actually, that we kind of acknowledge that. And then we have nature deficit disorder, including biodiversity net loss. So this might be a term that some of you, again, are very familiar with or not, so I'll just describe it for you. So nature deficit disorder is a term first used in 2005, and it refers to the disconnect people feel from nature as a result of not having access to natural environments. So an alienation or feelings of fear even towards nature, and a negative mental health state, including low mood or lack of attention span, are seen as side effects to this condition. So associated with this disorder is the corresponding nature knowledge deficit, which reveals a sense that we no longer know as much about nature and natural habitats as we used to. Respondents themselves feared that they would no longer have as much access to natural environments if the Knutsford Vale was developed on, and it would also negatively impact children as well. And it's worth adding here that the naturalness of Knutsford Vale was its primary attraction for all of the respondents. It is seen as offering something unique and special to local users that is unavailable at other open spaces. So the diversity of nature and wildlife is critical to this sentiment. So users of the space enjoy watching the bird life and watching for signs of wildlife. They also enjoy the variety and naturalness of the plant life in the space. And a number of respondents mentioned how watching the seasons change was important to them. And this is very much in contrast to the more sort of manicured parks that, you know, kind of provide an opposition to the Knutsford, an opposite example to Knutsford Vale. So people witnessing the Vale developing and altering over time increases the connection people feel to the space and the connections between their own heritage and that of the Vale. And all of this was deemed severely under risk. The other issue then is flood management and increased urban heat as a potential risk. So using green infrastructure for flood alleviation and management has economic as well as environmental value. And flood prevention was an important topic for many of the local residents. So they felt that their knowledge of the site and the impact of removing trees and scrub in particular was not taken into consideration. Not only was this demoralising for the residents, but it led to a sense of concern and stress for those living in the immediate area. So as I say, this kind of continuous added stress of having to fight a campaign is always in the background for all of this. Then we move into those other kind of social risks, so decreased community cohesion. So there was an understanding really amongst participants who cared for this space that there was a greater sense of community cohesion as one of the major benefits of the Knutsford Vale, as it provided a space for community activities as well as a space for social interaction. Of particular importance to residents was the role of the community in maintaining the Vale, leading them to view the space as an essential part of their community. And correspondingly, many people expressed a concern that losing the Vale in its current state would destroy the community cohesion. So this was a really strong thing that came out. And likewise, that then led into a sense of decreased care for place and local spaces. So again, many residents who are actively involved in the care and management of Knutsford Vale stated it as a hugely important site for ongoing living social and cultural heritage for local users. If the Vale is altered against the express wishes of the residents, then they will lose their connection to the local area. Furthermore, respondents feel like they are being discriminated against compared to residents from more affluent areas. And most worryingly, and this is really interesting, most residents noted that they wouldn't take part in similar caring activities elsewhere if the Vale was lost. So that kind of impact of actually, you know, having something that you've cared so much about suddenly taken away from you actually then impacts negatively how you treat other spaces or your attitude to other spaces. And then finally, this idea of a kind of distrust of policymakers and council representatives was also perceived as a risk in potentially losing this space. So respondents noted overwhelmingly that they did not want this proposed development to take place, and there was a sense of distrust towards the council, who respondents felt were not open and transparent. And many residents were fearful of the potential dangers of building on the land and feel that they'd not been adequately dealt with those concerns. So all of that then came out of qualitative interviewing, discussions and additional questionnaires with residents. There is a happy ending in the sense the Vale has been maintained and retained. So you know, I think largely due to the campaign from the residents, but also actually to do with the kind of headache that these kinds of sites pose for developers in terms of cleaning the land and making it adequate for development. But I think in all of this, for me, I think the emotion of the situation was, and all of these issues were kind of beautifully captured in a poem that was spontaneously written for us by a resident called Finola, entitled The Heron. So I'll just read this to you. So, a heron in Knutsford Vale, meandering in the rain, along the rough paths, through the wooded copses, amid the burgeoning green leaf and bird song, I saw the heron. It rose with 5 flaps of its huge curved wings from the reed-hidden pond to soar grey into the grey sky. Can you see me as you soar? Here in these few green acres, saved from the suburbs, to give lift to your wings and a home to wildness. But heron, your progeny and mine may not alight here. Herons need water and green trees and blue sky, but people need schools of brick and roads of paving and tarmac. And I need the wild surprise of a heron rising from a pond by a wood. So I'm now going to dive into the kind of second example. Let me just double check how we're doing with time. Yeah, this is fine. We're okay. We're on time. So this is where my current work is situated in Mars Platting, and it's part of a wider project on creative climate resilience and thinking about how climate resilience and community knowledge. How community knowledge can influence climate resilience, local climate resilience, and particularly how arts practices can be used, and using this to sort of shape and support local action planning. But I'm not really going to go too much into the kind of details of that project. What I wanted to focus on really was, as I say, Mars Platting and Newton Heath is an area that has some of the worst statistics in terms of health and economic deprivation in Manchester. And based on the earlier loss and bereavement literature that I mentioned, we can also start to assume that loss is a prevalent continuum within residents' lives from a human perspective, which is also disruptive and traumatic. So then we can begin to understand why the loss of community assets and specific spaces and places can add to the layers of grief within communities of high deprivation. So in Mars Platting, then you have this double layer of loss taking place. So the first is a loss over time of community assets, which either leave memorials of abandonment, as this Apollo pub next to one of the high rises that's kind of not having anything done to it. It's neither being knocked down nor is it being redeveloped. Neither is the land around it, and that's due to complex legal issues. But you also have other examples like this where, certain shops and post offices and so on have been taken down. You've just got these kinds of large swathes of empty green space. Or you have spaces like this, which are almost, you've got kind of these sort of strange burial mound looking lumps and ridges, which are actually evidencing the foundations of old houses and community buildings that haven't yet been replaced. And you can see here again on the edges these particular mounds. Another angle on this, so this is the first sort of layer of loss, if you like. So the actual loss of particular assets, and then you have these kind of remaining spaces that sort of evidence in some way that loss that hasn't been kind of responded to or hasn't been adequately replaced. But then there's another angle on this in other sites in Mars Platting and Newton Heath. So these are instead sites of old industrial works or leisure facilities or everyday shops that have been pulled down, and their stories that are attached to those sites have not really been collected or preserved in the material culture of that labour or leisure has all but kind of disappeared. So that's another layer of loss. And then you have this other layer that's now kicking in, which is frequently discussed by residents. So not only is there an encroachment on pre-existing green spaces and canal verges, but the loss of this new but limited green space, which has either been rewilded or now being used by the local community and is now valued as an asset, is increasingly being built up and developed. So you have spaces that have been essentially left after things have disappeared, and they've been reclaimed and reused in different ways, and now they are now under threat as well. So it's this kind of building up of loss in different ways over time. So there is this idea then that circulates around there being potential within loss. So Professor Jim Bendell, in his discussion of deep adaptation, presents the concept of relinquishment as the intentional letting go of certain assets, behaviours and beliefs where retaining them could make matters worse. So loss is seen as potentially generative and emancipatory, facilitating the emergence of new values and attachments and forms of significance. And he talks about pruning and forgetting as a kind of positive. So Bendell argues that we should aim to work with change rather than trying to arrest or reverse it. And there is this idea as well that, you know, spaces are continuously reborn, constantly growing and going through a process of ever new creative transformation. And I do largely kind of buy into that, but these kind of conceptual and rather abstract ideas can completely disregard the impact on communities that do potentially suffer under transformations that are done to them rather than not with them, and transformations that have removed any sense of agency or democratic participation. And again, a lot of the existing scholarship and literature doesn't really deal with that, how to deal with the kind of psychological and emotional impact of loss that comes out of regeneration programs in particular. So I just want to finish off then with some kind of recommendations for practice and policy. So in order to mitigate the risk and impacts of loss and change, this work has to be undertaken in a genuinely equitable and participatory way with residents, and risk to health to be assessed not by an economic baseline. So arguably what we see now in planning and development process is the antithesis of this. So consultations are no longer trusted, residents are all surveyed out, weariness and apathy has kicked in within many communities living within multiple disadvantage. So we have to change ways of working to potentially, first of all, not assume that loss is inevitable, you know, to kind of challenge that a little bit, and to take seriously the cases against loss of assets with regards to health and ecology. If loss is to be incurred, then to work with communities to identify where the potential lies for them and to ensure it materialises. So again, you know, we might have sort of promises of this being better for people, but to ensure that that kind of potential is realised. And finally, then to recognise that responses to loss emerge from a condition of love and care, and to be caring in response to this grief. And this final point, actually, I just want to really emphasise, because it's a really important one. In so many campaigns, I've seen a real disregard and almost disdain for people's emotions, which are genuinely felt and expressed, as I say, as a form of grief, and it comes from a place of love. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.